Growing information on the battlefield in the Russia-Ukraine war indicates that President Zelensky may be on the verge of taking the biggest gamble of his life, and certainly of this war. He may be willing to try and risk it all on an even bigger invasion into Russia. Now, this is not a good thing. When I say a gamble, that implies that there's a chance that you could win and win big, but maybe that's the wrong term, because I think that it's a fool's errand in any case. I don't think this has any chance of success, yet it appears, nevertheless, that that Ukraine is prepared to try the unthinkable into Russia, and that the Russian side seems to be aware of this, and are preparing an adequate response. And to try and break this down today, we have the ever inestimable Professor John Mearsheimer, international theorist extraordinaire, professor at the University of Chicago, and always a great guest here. Professor, welcome back.
Glad to be here, Danny.
Now, listen, I think that we may be a little surprised that we're even having this particular conversation today, because I honestly, I guess even as recently as maybe 2 weeks ago, I thought that the chance that the Ukraine side would actually launch a surprise offensive to be so remote as to be ridiculous, because it would have no chance of success. And yet we know, I think it was on the 6th of August is when they launched off into this. And now then here, information is coming out today that they may be thinking of expanding that. Now, just before we went on the air, you made an interesting comment I want our folks to get to hear. You said that unlike what might seem conventional wisdom, that Russia would not want to have an offensive into their area, you said maybe Russia might be licking their chops. Why would you say that?
Yeah, I mean, if I were playing Russia's hand, and there was evidence that the Ukrainians were thinking about launching another offensive beyond the Kursk offensive, I would be licking my chops. I'd be welcoming the opportunity to deal with that offensive. The fact is that if the Ukrainians go on the offensive, their troops are out in the open and they have no air cover. The Russians dominate the air, and the Russians have lots of drones, and the Russians have a huge advantage in artillery. So what's going to happen here is they're going to destroy huge numbers of Ukrainian armored vehicles, which they're doing, by the way, in the Kursk offensive. They're going to end up killing lots of Ukrainian soldiers. Many more Ukrainian soldiers are going to die than Russian soldiers, because the Ukrainians are out in the open and they're moving, and they are fat targets for the Russians, who again have control of the skies. So if you're in a war of attrition, where the casualty exchange ratio really matters, what you want is for the Ukrainians to launch offensives, to come out in the open, so that you can kill large numbers of Ukrainian armored vehicles and large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers. There's another dimension to this, Danny, which cannot be underestimated. And that is that the main battles are taking place out on the Eastern Front, in the eastern part of Ukraine, around cities like Pokrovsk. And what's happening here is that the Ukrainians, who were already in trouble on the Eastern Front before launching the Kursk offensive, are now in even worse trouble on the Eastern Front because of all the forces they've sent into Kursk. So if you're talking about launching another offensive, you're effectively giving up the war in Eastern Ukraine. Why would you do this?
We actually have some imagery on that. We're going to actually get into those very issues here. But first of all, specifically on Pokrovsk, which you just mentioned here, yesterday Zelensky went on to, as he does all the time, to try to give an update to publicly to his people. He had a kind of mixed messages in what he ended up saying. He's trying to be positive, but watch this clip here.
There have already been several reports by Commander-in-Chief Sursky. The front line, our positions, primarily it is the Pokrovsk direction, our Donetsk region. We understand the enemy's steps, and we are getting stronger. We have checked the ammunition supply, and it is very important that our partners really fulfill their obligations. on each package, on all our agreements. This is fundamental for our defense. Our operation in the Kursk region, our combat work continues. Steps are being taken. We control the designated areas.
So, I mean, first of all, he says, we are aware of what the enemy is doing in Pokrovsk along the entire east there, and we're stabilizing the situation. But then in the very next breath, shifts to say, we've looked at the ammo situation, and apparently it's not good. And that's why he's trying to be more and more emphatic to his Western partners to give more. But, John, I'm not sure that they have a lot more to give.
I think that's not the important point. First of all, there's just no question that we don't have more to give. The real problem here is when he says that we are getting stronger in the Pokrovsk area. This is delusional. They are actually getting weaker. There is all sorts of discussion about this very fact among the Russians, among Ukrainian bloggers, and in the Western media. They are pulling forces off of the Eastern Front. They're pulling forces away from Pokrovsk and moving them toward the Kursk region. They are getting weaker in that area. They are not getting stronger. And this is facilitating a quicker Russian victory in that area.
Yeah, and of course, then you have the commensurate problem that you just pointed out in the north with the Kursk operation as well. But here's the surprising part, and this is a lot of people are not aware of this yet because it hasn't made a lot of the news in the Western media. But I actually yesterday had one of the mappers actually from Asia. Actually, he's a great one on this situation here. But he was on our channel. He first of all told me a little bit about, which I did not know yesterday afternoon, that we were talking about how many forces the Ukraine side had still deployed for the Kursk invasion. But in telling me that, he also showed me that there were other groupings. Watch this.
Reserve force here. Another one is here. There's another group here. So there's a few reserve force that is supporting the operation around here, around the main front. There's this huge force that is around Tekino, which I believe is the aim is to attack in from the western part of this Glushkovo conundrum. Then there is also this group of forces where the command post was allegedly just destroyed by the Russians over at Khrushchev.
Yeah, I saw that.
And this was actually the initial force that was expected to attack towards Rylis, together with this force that's supposed to break through at Kerenevo. So it's supposed to be a pincer and they're supposed to capture a much bigger ground. But it seems like they cannot break through here. So this force is not committed. So now they're going for a smaller target. It seems like that's the case.
So he was telling me yesterday he wasn't sure what those other two formations were going to do besides the ones that were specifically to reinforce the Kursk area. But today, Military Summary added that there was even more troops in this area than we thought. Watch this.
Ukrainians have concentrated along the border with the Bryansk region. So this is the Bryansk region with the border with Kursk region and with the border with Belgorod region, around 33% of their entire army that can conduct a successful offensive operation. 33% of Ukrainian forces are concentrated exactly in this point. And the Russians are saying that they have no doubts that the Ukrainians in the very near future are going to begin a full-scale offensive operation in the Bryansk direction, and they will continue offensive operation in the Kursk direction, and that Ukrainians are planning to continue their offensive operation in Belgorod direction. So this is not like offensive operation to conquer the territories or something like this. This is something like ultimatum to Vladimir Putin to begin the negotiation process and to restore control the constitutional order of Ukraine at the level of 1991.
Now, I'm going to get to what the tactics and the tactical objectives might be for this force in just a second, but I want to zero in on the last part of that first, because I've heard that from in terms of the overall objective of the whole offensive from Zelensky and Yermak and several others, that they want to improve their negotiating position. I wonder if you can just talk for a second on the likelihood that Russia would give in to something like this and actually negotiate from a position of weakness?
Well, it all depends on what happens on the battlefield. If you're going to tell a story where the Ukrainians shift the momentum of the war and the balance of casualties begins to move against the Russians begin to lose the war, the Ukrainians begin to get the upper hand, then you can convince me that you may be able to go to the negotiating table and work out a deal that's reasonably favorable to the Ukrainians. But what's happening here is that the Ukrainians are taking a bad situation on the battlefield and making it worse. And that means that the idea that this is going to lead to them getting the Russians to go to the negotiating table and getting a pretty good deal out of the Russians is a laughable argument. That's not going to happen. The Eastern Front is going to collapse if 33% of the Ukrainian army is deployed in the general area of Kursk, right? If 33%, 1/3 of the Ukrainian army, which was barely holding on along the Eastern Front before the Kursk offensive, has now taken 33% of its army and deployed it in an area that's far away from the Eastern Front, the Eastern Front is doomed, and that matters enormously. And furthermore, the idea that this 33% of the Ukrainian army that's now going to launch an offensive into Russia is going to score a stunning victory, and the Russians are therefore going to come to the negotiating table, is not a serious argument. They are going to launch an offensive without air superiority, without air cover, to put it bluntly, and they're going to be out in the open, as I said before, and the Russians are going to cut them to doll rags. This is just not going to work. And if you look at what has been happening since August 6th in the Kursk region, the Russians have inflicted massive casualties on the Ukrainian armored forces, and they've killed large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers. And to begin with, the Ukrainians did not have a very large reserve of armored vehicles, and they're certainly desperate on the manpower front. So I don't understand how this works. I don't understand how the Ukrainians shift the military balance in their favor and therefore are well positioned to negotiate their way out of this war.
Well, I think it's more along the lines of the word you use very often on our show because it's so applicable, is it's delusional and they're desperate. And so I want to look at what Weave Union, and a third mapper here, is talking about what is the potential objectives of this force on the tactical level. And then we'll talk on the backside of that about what that might mean. Watch this.
This means that what we've seen in Kursk is merely the beginning, as only a fraction of the Ukrainian forces that has been concentrated in the north have engaged in combat. It is reported that the Ukrainians are building up their forces both in the direction of Lviv here in the north, as well as within the road between Sumy and Lviv, where the Ukrainian objective here is to launch an operation towards Rilsk by attacking the area between Lvov and Rilsk at the same time as attacking Rilsk directly from the west. This in combination with an assault towards the south of the same river, which means that the Ukrainians are here looking to attack in 3 separate directions to not only gain control over the south of the same river by cutting off the Russian forces in the area, but to take that as an advantage to push towards Rilsk.
So you see what at least the alleged plan is that they're going to take this bridgehead they started in the Kursk area and then now start a new one to the west of that, and then a third one to the south to try and bring this entire area, which is relatively large, if they were able to pull this off, while the Russia is still trying to bring in some reserves. I'm going to speak about that part in just a second, about what the Russians are doing as a result. But I think that there is some plausibility that they can at least make some kind of temporary incursion into this and possibly even succeed in occupying some territory. But here's the big problem with just this part, and I'm only going to talk about the northern part here for a second, is the sustainment. How do you sustain this and keep the flanks open and keep the support coming in? Because as you just pointed out, there's a large number of both equipment, vehicles, and personnel that they're sacrificing here. And I just don't know how much more that they had to keep these things going on. So aside from whatever you may want to cause later on, I don't know how they maintain this one.
I don't either. I mean, again, let's go back to the period before August 6th. Virtually everyone agreed that the Ukrainians were desperate for manpower. They were having great difficulty replacing the losses in the battles on the Eastern Front with the Russians. And now all of a sudden we're hearing that they have all of these forces that can be deployed not only to fight on the Eastern Front, but to launch new offensives into Russia proper. How can this be? Where did these forces come from? And then when you read about the Kursk offensive, the one that started on August 6th, it seems clear from almost all the reports on both sides, the Western/Ukrainian side and on the Russian side, that the Ukrainians cobbled together all the available forces that they could scrounge up to fight this war in the Kursk region. But now we're being told that they still have many more forces left that will enable them to launch even more offensives. And they'll be able to sustain the offensive in the Kursk region, which is devouring lots of manpower, and they'll be able to hold on in the Pokrovsk area on the Eastern Front. Remember, Zelensky said the situation is improving there. This all fails the common sense test, right? The whole discourse about the war in Ukraine, in the West and in Ukraine itself, bears little resemblance to reality. I just, find it hard to believe that people are making these arguments about.
Now, part of the answer to one of the things you said about where do the troops come from, I've noticed over the last couple of months that there have been reports that Russia had been massing some forces around the Sumy area, and that they had had commensurate responses of the Ukraine side to move some mobile troops in the south there in anticipation of an attack into the Sumy area from Russia. And so it appears that Ukraine took the opportunity to make it look like they were preparing defensive troops when actually they were mobilizing offensive potential. So that apparently did catch Russia by some surprise, though I have heard some reports that the Russians possibly thinking along the same lines that you did, say that they were aware of that and were okay with that because it could potentially end the war quicker if they destroy these troops coming out before that. But one of the objectives, at least it was stated by numerous people in terms of what Ukraine wanted to accomplish here in support of the Pokrovsk area, was that they wanted Russia to withdraw some troops from the Eastern Front up into here to relieve pressure on that. But as Sky, one of the few good ones this morning, actually, analysis on Sky News this morning told that that's not how it's working out. Watch this.
They don't want to hold this ground long term. So how does Putin react to this?
Yeah, that's the big question here. The first response to that, which we expected for the last couple of weeks, was that President Putin is Mr. Security. This is the first time Russia's been invaded since 1941. He'd be deeply embarrassed. He needs to deal with it. He knows he's got Ukraine battle-hardened troops in there, so pulling them in from Kaliningrad or Crimea doesn't cut it. He really needs to move troops from the front line here and deal with it ruthlessly. And of course, that's probably what Ukraine wanted. That's not his only option, though. The other option, of course, that he has available is that Donbass is the main effort for him. He's now got up to 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers, probably battle-hardened, that are now fixed well away from the front line. He can largely leave that and deal with this in the south. And therefore, because Ukraine is limited in resources, he knows it's going to be potentially an easier job in the south, and therefore deal with that later.
Now, and I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about the Russian reaction so far and what we've seen. But I want to zero in on something here because a lot of the commentary in the West is that, this incursion is going to embarrass Putin. It's going to make people think that he's losing confidence in his leadership, et cetera. But he said something I think is very important there for the West to understand. He said, this is the first time Russian territory has been invaded since 1941, which elicits lots of emotions from the Russian side. And from what I've been able to see from some people who have access to the what the people in Russia are thinking, this has had something like a Pearl Harbor moment reaction to them, to where it's made them angry, and they're demanding even more from Russia, from Putin, not less, not make a negotiated settlement, to push harder and take even more. How do you see that?
I agree completely. I don't know what to say. The idea that the Russian people are going to rise up as a result of the Kursk offensive and overthrow Putin, it's not a serious argument. It's not going to happen. And if anything, the opposite is going to happen, as you said. I don't think this is the equivalent of Pearl Harbor, because I think most Russians fully understand that this is a desperate gamble and not that great a threat to Mother Russia. But nevertheless, the idea that a foreign country has invaded your country is, if anything, going to have a rally around the flag effect, and that's what it's doing. So, this doesn't improve the situation. This whole argument that, Putin has been embarrassed and his embarrassment matters is, again, not a serious argument. Maybe he was embarrassed, but so what? Is this going to affect the war? Please tell me how embarrassment affects the casualty exchange ratio, how
Right.
it affects the outcome of the war. I don't know what people are talking about.
Yeah, I think that's part of the what's the word? The media savvy part of this whole conflict that has really infected the West and Ukraine from the beginnings. That they think these things matter. We've shown a number of videos here especially over this year, to where you have, it looks like a scene from a motion picture where the camera is panning and it's tilting, and there's sometimes even music playing behind it, whatever, because it looks good to a Western audience, but it has no relation to what's actually happening on the battlefield and where the lines are going. And I think that's what may end up being one of the biggest and possibly fatal flaws of the whole way that the West and Ukraine is addressing the war.
Well, this is really all about propaganda, and Western propaganda is superb. There's no question about it. The ability of the West to spin what's happening on the battlefield in a way that makes it look like Ukraine is doing well, it stands a good chance of turning the tide, is really quite remarkable. And the problem is that all of this propaganda has created a completely distorted picture in the West of what is actually happening on the battlefields in Ukraine. And the fact is that the Ukrainians are in desperate straits, and there's no way they can win this war. And if that basic message had been put forward months ago, there's a good chance that this war could have been settled then to the advantage of the Ukrainians. But instead, we have created this false narrative that the Ukrainians are doing well, and if we just give them some more weapons, they'll do even better. This line of argument bears little resemblance to reality and is basically going to end up making the Ukrainians worse off rather than better off.
Right. That's actually one of the things that struck to me in a very negative way. Shortly after this happened, you may have seen Lindsey Graham came out and was basically like a cheerleader and looked like a little middle schooler, just being happy because, I don't know, his football team won a game or something like that. And he says, yeah, go kick Putin's ass. That's an actual quote, because of what happened here. And he was just gleeful about it, actually thinking that it somehow mattered, not even realizing that it's going to mean thousands more Ukrainian deaths. And ultimately, I just don't see any possibility that they can hold this territory anyway. And then the question is, what was it all for? But that didn't seem to bother all the Western media from giving him coverage and handing him the mic and giving him interviews elsewhere.
It's quite clear that Lindsey Graham has zero appreciation of basic military strategy and tactics. And he has this view of what's happening in Ukraine that bears little resemblance to reality. And it's, easy for him to get on TV in this day and age and make these pronouncements that attract a lot of attention and put him up in bright lights. But in terms of sound analysis, his comments are the exact opposite of sound analysis.
And you know, it's one thing if you have a Lindsey Graham who's a politician and all he does is live for the moment of any kind of benefit he can get. But sometimes we've even seen a lot of 4-star generals or 3-star generals in our side give almost equally bad advice and suggestions about what's going on here. But there has been one here recently, and I want to say this was just a couple of days ago. Anders Nielsen, who's an analyst that has a YouTube channel here, has put some pretty good information out there, and he addressed something that is in the West that another aspect of why Putin has come under a lot of Western heat, allegedly that he's been indecisive and he hasn't really known what he was doing. He said this. Watch this.
So if we look at the Russian response to the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, and we can see that it's been kind of slow, they haven't really managed to find a way to stop the Ukrainians yet, then I think we need to be careful not to interpret that as a sign that they're lost or that they don't know what to do. I think we can just as well see that as a sign that Putin has decided to go for escalation, that he wants the big package. He wants to expand the fighting force to include the conscripts. And then
And the conscripts there, if that continued on, he said that basically Russia had 250,000 men in the region there that had not been even fought yet, that it was on the Russian side that he could, and that number could be doubled, so that there could be a huge number that is not yet in contact, completely separate from anything going on in the Eastern Front there. And then we also had yesterday Dmitry Medvedev say, forget about this whole thing about making us go in to do negotiations. He's saying that we've made the West has made things worse for Ukraine, and that there will be much more pointless spending and a radically higher number of caskets. There will be no negotiations until the enemy is completely destroyed. Now, I know a lot of people want to dismiss Dmitry Medvedev as a hothead, etc., but what he's saying there is being echoed by quite a number of other people in the Russian side, that now then Putin needs to just defeat militarily Ukraine and not even worry about trying to have negotiations. And what you just heard Anders Nielsen there talking about, that Putin is now looking at potentially expanding the number of troops by a large number of combat forces engaging into this, which could potentially make that possible. How do you see that possibility?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that the narrative which says that Putin is concentrating on what's going on the Eastern Front at this point in time, and he's kind of written off what's going on in Kursk, and he'll deal with that later, is wrongheaded. There's no question that the Russians are wisely not removing large numbers of troops from the Eastern Front and moving to the Kursk region. So that is all for the positive from the Russian point of view, all for the good from the Russian point of view. But the Russians are dealing at the moment with the Kursk offensive. Basically, what they have done is contained it. They have troops around this salient. They've contained it. And while the Ukrainians are trying to extend the size of the territory that they have conquered by launching offensives, the Russians are taking aim at those offensive Ukrainian forces and destroying them in large numbers. So the casualty numbers on the Ukrainian side are estimated to be around 4,000. They went in with a force of about 10, maybe 12,000 troops. There were about 10 to 12,000 troops at the peak deployed inside of the Kursk salient, as best I could tell. And it looks like about 4,000 of them have already been casualties. Huge numbers of armored vehicles and artillery pieces on the Ukrainian side have been destroyed. So the Russians are tearing apart those forces, those Ukrainian forces that are inside the Kursk salient. It's not like the Russians are just letting the Ukrainians run wild in the streets. They're containing them. Of course, they will eventually have to reduce this salient once those troops that Putin is talking about mobilizing are brought to bear. But that can wait for another day.
Right. Yeah. And that really illustrates the luxury that Putin has, because he has the forces He has the time, and he has the industrial capacity and ammunition, all those kind of things that go along with that, to be able to take his time and not rush to failure, as we used to say in the Army. So he's, I think, doing that. And the West is viewing that as, well, if he didn't immediately rush, an armored division over to mess it up or to take care of that, then it must be weakness. But I think that's because, as you implied a second ago, there's not very many people in the West that understand strategy and how things work in the context of a war. Now, I want to expand out a little bit into your area of expertise, especially the international relations, and look at the strategic level here, because there's something else going on that not many have caught in the headlines, especially in Russia and China, and that is that the Chinese premier just went on a state visit to Russia for a couple of several days here, and both sides put out a readout of what happened here. And I wonder if you could tell me what you think about the view. Now, from the Russian side, they said that we see the international situation is rapidly changing. Russia is under tremendous external pressure. The military confrontation between Ukraine and Russia has entered a new stage. What they're talking about, the incursion into Kursk. The Chinese side, in their readout of what had happened, Gary, if you can throw that second one up there. This is also these are both from today. This is from the Global Times of the Chinese side. They say, according to the text of the joint communique released by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the two countries will boost all-around cooperation in many fields, in addition to traditional areas like trade, investment, finance, and energy. It also includes pragmatic cooperation on artificial intelligence, technology, cybersecurity, and aerospace cooperation. To what extent do you think it's even possible that China could expand their support militarily to the Russian side?
Well, the question, Danny, is what do you think the Chinese could potentially do to improve Russia's situation? In other words, what do the Russians need that the Chinese can give them? I don't see much there. It's not like the Russians are short of aircraft, short of artillery, and the Chinese are certainly not going to provide manpower. It may be that the Russians need more chips, and the Chinese can give them chips or some other form of sophisticated technology. But my guess would be that they're already giving them those sorts of items if the Russians need them, because it's easy to do that surreptitiously. So I don't think that the Russians need that much from the Chinese at this point in time, except for diplomatic support. And they are getting diplomatic support. So that's
and I guess also with the fact that Iran and North Korea are giving direct military assistance, potentially China could help with that too. I suppose it's, again, surreptitious, as you say. But do you see any concern, especially given this big BRICS meeting that's coming in October, that we're seeing that things continue to shift globally in a direction that strengthens the Russia, Ukraine, and their allied side against the West?
There's no question about that. And it's not just the Ukraine war that's doing that. One could argue it's more due to the Gaza genocide. The fact is that given the fact that the United States is complicitous in this genocide and is supporting Israel at every turn, and has shown little interest in upholding international law in the process, countries all around the world are disgusted with the United States. They're angry at the United States. So the Gaza genocide, coupled with what's happening in Ukraine, have done enormous damage to our reputation around the world.
And to what extent might the Chinese side, or maybe a better question, how do you think it might impact the Chinese in terms of what they're going to do and what kind of foreign policy they may have when they see that the West, in its confrontation with Ukraine, has not only given authorization to use weapons and ammunition against Russia, but now have either tacitly or overtly given them permission to actually attack into the territory of Russia? Might they see any concerns in a potential future Taiwan-China engagement that we might try to do the same thing into Chinese territory?
Well, I think most people understand that if push comes to shove, the United States will defend Taiwan. And one could argue that from a Chinese point of view, if you look at how deeply committed the United States is to defending or helping to defend Ukraine, the lengths that we've gone to keep Ukraine in the fight, it would seem that one should assume from the Chinese perspective that the United States would do the same with regard to Taiwan. So I would imagine the Chinese, looking at what's happening in Ukraine, would think that they're not going to get a free pass on Taiwan, that they're going to have to deal with the Americans and other allies of the United States in East Asia if they were to get into a war over Taiwan.
And on the one hand, that could seem to deter China from doing something, but could there be any negative side of that it might get them to act more aggressively directly against the United States or their interests? How might that play out?
Well, I think it's more likely that that scenario will take place in the South China Sea. I think the more dangerous of the two places, here we're talking about Taiwan versus the South China Sea. I think the South China Sea is the more dangerous place. And there's a real danger that the Filipinos and the Chinese will get dragged into a conflict over these islets or shoals that the two countries both believe belong to them. And if a conflict were to break out between the Philippines and China, the United States would likely get dragged in on the side of the Philippines. I think there's a real possibility of conflict there. So I think the South China Sea is where we could have trouble. And in that scenario, one can imagine the Chinese thinking that the Americans are pinned down in the Middle East and they're pinned down in Europe. And here we're talking about Ukraine. And therefore, we have an opportunity to take advantage of the Philippines in the South China Sea because the Americans have taken their eye off the ball. If you've seen any of these charts that depict American naval deployments into the greater Middle East, because of the threat of an Iranian attack on Israel, it's really quite amazing how many naval assets we have in the greater Middle East. And some of those naval assets have been swung out of East Asia. So one could argue that given that we're not really pivoting to Asia as much as we should be, if you're bent on containing China, that there may be an opportunity for the Chinese to take advantage of the United States in the South China Sea. But I don't think that's true over Taiwan. I don't think there's going to be any trouble over Taiwan or any conflict over Taiwan in the foreseeable future. I'm not saying that's 100% certain, but I think it's highly unlikely. South China Sea is a different matter. And you do want to appreciate the fact that we are so deeply involved in the Middle East and in Ukraine that we do not have that much time to spend thinking about deterrence and containment in East Asia.
And since you mentioned the Middle East here in the last few minutes that we have, and wonder if you can just kind of give your assessment of what situation is in the Middle East, because on the one hand, you have the U.S. at least ostensibly trying to seek a negotiated settlement or at least a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, but there's also concurrent signs that in Newsweek last week, for example, the senior Israeli official gave a public interview that said that they view a war with Iran as inevitable and wanted the United States to get involved quickly. And there's also evidence that they're thinking about going into southern Lebanon against Hezbollah so that things could wide open. All the while, we're waiting to find out if Iran is going to retaliate or how they're going to retaliate against Israel for what happened in Tehran with the assassination of Haniyeh. How do you see all this playing out here in the near term, and what are your concerns about the U.S. interests?
Well, in terms of how this is playing out and is likely to play out, the war in Gaza has not ended. The Israelis are still deeply involved in Gaza. They're still killing Palestinians in large numbers. And all this talk about a ceasefire seems to be empty rhetoric. Tony Blinken is constantly saying the Israelis agree to the ceasefire deal that we Americans are pushing forward. And then Benjamin Netanyahu makes it clear that he's agreed to no such deal. So it doesn't look like the war in Gaza is going to be shut down. With regard to the conflict with Hezbollah, if anything, that's escalating these days. And as long as the war in Gaza continues, the war with Hezbollah, or the war between Hezbollah and Israel, will continue. And then there's Iran, as you were mentioning, and the Iranians have promised that they're going to attack Israel in retaliation for the July 31st murder of Haniyeh in Tehran, but they have not retaliated. So it's an open question when that will happen, or if it will happen. But in the meantime, relations between Iran and Israel and Iran and the United States are terrible. And one can imagine those terrible relations leading to a conflict involving all three of those powers. So we are still in deep trouble in the Middle East, we meaning the United States, because we're in the middle of this, simply because we're joined at the hip with Israel. And I don't see us getting out of this mess anytime soon. We're not going to end the trouble with the Palestinians. We're not going to end the trouble with Hezbollah, and we're not going to end the trouble with Iran. These problems are going to go on and on and on. And as I said a few minutes ago, this has negative consequences for our position in East Asia. For those of us who believe that China is the single most important threat to the United States, the fact that we're not able to, pivot to Asia in a meaningful way, and we're not able to focus on containing China, and we're instead consumed with dealing with the Russians in Ukraine and supporting the Israelis in the Middle East is not good news.
So in closing, let me ask you this question. Given all those things we've just talked about, whether it's the Indo-Pacific, Europe, or the Middle East, and all of that chaos you just ably described there, what is if the United States was going to do what made sense, and forget about whether it's politically doable or not, because it's not. Nothing is, because neither Republican or Democrat, no matter who wins this, and the elite in Washington, I think, has any capacity to do the right thing. But if they put you in charge, for example, and whoever wins in November just said, you know what, we're going to finally put somebody as Secretary of State who actually knows what they're doing. What could we do to, if you can, kind of win over the world to try to limit our exposure in Europe and the Middle East, and prepare and deter in the Indo-Pacific? Should we continue on with these wars, or can we extract ourselves, even if you had full power?
Well, if I were God, and you'd have to be God, not just Secretary of State, because if you were just Secretary of State, you would run into huge resistance from the foreign policy establishment, from the deep state, to not pursue the policies I would prescribe. But first of all, I would go to great lengths to end the Ukraine war as quickly as possible. As you and I have talked about on numerous occasions, this war needs to be shut down, and I would go to great lengths to shut it down. And I would go to great lengths to improve relations with the Russians. I think it's in our strategic interest to have good relations with Russia. So that would be my first move. And my second move would be to treat Israel as a normal country. I would end the special relationship. I would treat Israel like a normal country. And by the way, let me make it perfectly clear. I think that would be to Israel's advantage. I think the special relationship we have, where we support Israel no matter what it does, including when it pursues foolish policies, makes no sense, not only for us, but for them as well. Regardless, I treat Israel as a normal country. I'd put huge pressure on Israel to work out some sort of modus vivendi with the Palestinians, put an end to the war between Hezbollah and Israel. And I then go to great lengths to improve relations with the Iranians and get away from this situation where we consider the Iranians to be the font of all evil. And we allow the Israelis to drag us into conflicts with the Iranians. This is not in our interest. What we have to do is work overtime to create a more stable Middle East. And I think if we can create a more stable Middle East and we can put an end to the war in Ukraine and improve relations with Russia, then we can concentrate on having a smart strategy in East Asia that contains any Chinese aggression.
Well, I certainly advocate all of those things, and it's I guess painful to hear you say accurately that it would require the power of God to do, because a normal person would have such resistance from the deep state, and that's the reason why that's so painful, is because that resistance is laying the foundation for our eventual harm. And what you described there would be the best way to ensure our long-term stability, strength, economic prosperity across the board, you name it, to get rid of these wars that are not necessary. But I guess we have what we have, so we have to do the best we can to try and achieve that outcome anyway.
You know, Danny, if you look at American foreign policy since the Cold War ended, especially after the year 2000, but even in the 1990s, it is truly amazing what a bad job we have done trying to run the world. We have created one disaster after another. Really remarkable. That's my first point. The second point is it's amazing the extent to which the foreign policy establishment has not learned and continues to pursue basically the same policies. Really remarkable. We are in deep trouble because the foreign policy establishment has blown it. Nevertheless, we continue marching down the same road. And I don't know what we can hope for to change this situation at this
Well, unfortunately, I have another clip to show that just illustrates just how difficult it is, because the view you just painted is the reality. Here from President Biden on Monday is a view of what people think. Watch this.
Name me a country in the world that doesn't think we're the leading nation in the world. Without America, not a joke, think about it. I'm being literal. Who could lead the world other than the United States of America? Well, guess what? America's winning, and the world's better off for it.
America is winning and the world's better off for it because we're running the show. And you talk about the wreckage from the end of the Cold War forward, rather contradictory views. And I think we know which one predominates in the media.
Yeah, I think there's not much question about that.
Wow, that is such a stark contrast to the actual reality, and it's troubling because you heard how everyone was cheering and screaming in their place, and you could have said the same thing in the Republican National Convention, and they probably would have done the same thing. That illustrates the problem, is that this is one place where I'd like to see some division between R's and D's, and unfortunately they seem to clap together on that part there, but. Anyway, we have what we have. But listen, I appreciate you coming back on today. And again, as you always do, show the clarity on what should happen and the fact that it's actually possible that there is a path to actually eliminating some of these threats using diplomacy and common sense and sanity, as opposed to leading with military pressure and power that just causes more and more trouble. So we really appreciate you coming on showing that today.
My pleasure, Danny. I look forward to coming back.
Look forward to having you back too as well. And we look forward to having you guys on with us today. In fact, we're going to ask you to come back at 3:00 today. We have not Larry Johnson. Sorry, that was yesterday. We have Tony Schaefer on at 3:00 today. And he's always a fun one to listen to. He's always got some interesting things to say, and you're not going to want to miss that. 3 p.m. today on Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Please do like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't done that already. It's a lot more important than you may think. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.